we could have a big knockdown, drag-out fight about this, but I thought maybe in the spirit of opening this thing with comedy and bipartisan respect that if it's the appropriate time to do it, I would nominate April Sims to serve as our temporary chair.
I would second that.
Joe, there's a second nomination and a second for April Sims to act as temporary chair of the commission. All right. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Congratulations, April. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you and go from there. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the nomination, Paul, and thank you to my fellow commissioners. I think the first item of business then is to approve the agenda for this meeting that should have been sent out. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the agenda? All right.
Move adoption of the agenda.
Second if we need it.
All right. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All right.
Great agenda.
What's that?
Great agenda.
I wasn't sure if I was moving too fast, if that's discussion. All right. So all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? All right. Motion carries. Agenda passes. That was easy. So cooking right along then. The first item on the agenda then is a briefing on financial disclosure and requirements from Bernard Dean and Brad Henderson.
So this is not really much of a briefing. It's more of a information to share with you all for awareness purposes. Three of you are used to submitting personal financial affairs statements in your role as former legislators, as well as candidates for public office. I'm not sure, Commissioner Sims, if you've ever been in that position, but we did want to reference that the statute, part of the authorizing statute for the Redistricting Commission does require that commissioners submit what they're called F1 personal financial affairs statements within 2 weeks of your appointment, which means that you will need to go to the PDC website, and they now are only taking electronic filing. That's a new development as of the last year or so. And so you will need to disclose all of your personal financial interests, including interests that your spouse may have, and all of that will need to be submitted to the PDC. I did talk to the PDC a little bit earlier today. They are available if you have any questions, and so feel free to reach out to them if you have any questions about your filing obligations. And I think your director, once hired, will also be required to file, as well as the chair, which hopefully we'll have appointed soon. The permanent chair, I should say. Brad, I don't know if you want to add any of that.
No, I think that's all correct, Bernard. Yeah, we believe that the director would qualify under having to submit an F1. There may be individual staff that are hired on the commission in addition to the director, communications staff, for instance, which also may be required, but I think those are going to require some conversations probably between the director and the PDC, or the chair and the PDC.
And will the staff be trained on that, or will you provide an additional briefing for them once hired?
Sure, we're happy to provide more information, and the PDC will be available to answer questions as well.
Okay. Any questions from my fellow commissioners? Well, we had a whole 15 minutes allocated for this conversation, so we are moving right along then. All right, well, if there are no questions, thank you for that update. Up next is a briefing on the Open Public Meetings Act and the Public Disclosure Act.
There we go. My computer didn't want to unmute. That's one of the fun things we deal with Zoom nowadays. Good evening. I'm Morgan Damerow. I'm Assistant Attorney General and the lead attorney for our office's Public Records Consultation Program. and also serving in some capacities helping with our Ombuds program for open public meetings issues. Thank you for inviting me to spend a little bit of time with you this evening talking about the OPMA and the Public Records Act. Just in terms of big picture, my plan is this evening to kind of go through both areas of law kind of quickly. We only have about 20 minutes. As commissioners, there is obligations to do training under 42, for the Open Public Meetings Act and on the Public Records Act. We're not going to be able to go into enough detail to satisfy both of those, but it's something that I'm happy to help you with, or we have videos on our website that you can watch on your own time as well to satisfy that. It's nice to be speaking with a group that has some familiarity with both of these laws. It helps having this kind of a general conversation. And rather than taking too much time with that, I'm just going to jump right into kind of some key points on the Open Public Meetings Act. As I'm talking here, of course, feel free to interrupt me, ask questions if there's something specifically you want to talk about. I'll see what I can do. But from a big picture point of view, starting with the Open Public Meetings Act, it covers all meetings that you folks are going to have. And when I say meetings, that covers a broad range of topics. That is not just when you're taking final action and when you're voting on something. It means when you're having the discussions as well. If you're taking public testimony, this is the chance for the public to see the wheels of government spinning and see what it goes to, kind of use a Wizard of Oz reference to look behind the curtain and to see how it is that we end up places, so that they can understand the outcome that happens. There are three kinds of meetings. One of them you're not going to have to probably worry about, but the one you'll meet with most often is going to be a regular meeting. Those are the ones that happen per your schedule when you establish it, and when you publish that in the WACs. There are special meetings like you're having today that was called on. Basically, it's anything but a regular meeting, and you're coming together to meet with a specific issue for organization like this. And then there could be emergency meetings, which are things to deal with, like natural disaster, something if there's going to be a loss of life, significant loss of property. In 20 some odd years of practicing law, I've never had to do an emergency meeting, so I'd be very surprised if this group finds itself in that capacity. But as I said, meetings are it's not just the final action where you're taking a vote and trying to resolve the issues before you. Action under the OPMA covers everything from the discussions, trying to reach consensus, really kind of seeing, having the discussion, the real kind of the meat and bones about what you're trying to resolve, and for this in your work. Something to keep in mind is a meeting happens in any time that there is a quorum of this commission together. So that means that if the three of you are in a meeting someplace and ends up talking about redistricting issues, you are now having an open meeting, or you're having meetings subject to the Open Meetings Act. And if you haven't given proper notice, you now have an OPMA violation. And so you really have to be cautious of it. It's a little bit easier nowadays because we're not running into each other as much as we normally do. But that doesn't mean it's without peril. You can have a meeting arise if it comes up via email. Let's say there's two commissioners that are emailing each other and a third one gets drawn into that email conversation. You've now had this serial kind of meeting develop where you've now you've crossed that line in terms of having an OPMA qualifying meeting. The place we're seeing it more often nowadays is social media as well. So you got to be very careful about what you're posting on your social media sites. If the commissioners end up being friends or whatnot in their social media, you can have a public meeting arise in social media as well. So you really have to be cautious about all these places communications can arise. In terms of, that doesn't mean you can't be social, you can't travel together if you're going someplace like that. You just have to be very careful, think about the appearances, and make sure you're very careful not to talk shop. Talk about everything else going on in the world except your work on the commission. In terms of the Open Public Meetings Act, for all of your regular meetings, you're going to have to do the same thing that you did tonight. You're going to have an agenda. That's going to have to be published 24 hours in advance. I know that your website isn't up and running yet, so I know you have a lot of work in front of you. Being a small commission with less than 10 members, you're technically not required to put it there, but obviously, the more notice you give to people, the better off you'll be. For special meetings like you had this evening, that's why there is the email. Those can be called by a majority of commission members or by your chair to set a special meeting. And same idea happens where 24 hours in advance, you have to have that notice of meeting put out. If this was a normal time period, you'd have to have where that meeting is going to happen, what time the meeting is, the business you're going to transact. And kind of the difference between them is with a special meeting, you can't take final action. You're kind of stuck with what's on that meeting agenda. With a regular meeting, you can build an agenda, but you can change it as well. What I commonly see is at the beginning of a regular meeting, one of the council members will make a motion to add an item because something's come up they want to discuss. You can do that in a regular meeting, and you could push that through to final action. In a special meeting, you can't take final action on those kinds of things. Kind of one of those, something that surprises people from time to time, I think, is that, the Open Public Meetings Act is a chance for people to observe meetings. Nothing in the OPMA says that there's an obligation for you to take public comment. Lots of agencies, the leadership they do that for lots of reasons, but that's not an OPMA requirement. There may be some other law that would require public comment to be accepted. I know it happens in the higher education world a fair amount. Some counties run into this with land use issues and things like that, but those are laws outside of the OPMA. Right now, we're living in an unusual time. So, and if these were normal times, then the other thing and you can see it in its title, the Open Public Meetings Act. The idea is that people get to come, they get to watch the meeting. They could walk in the door, sit down in the back of the room, and watch the deliberations happen. Same idea is going on right now, but because we're working under Proclamation 2028, then the public has to be able to, at an absolute minimum, be able to hear and be heard through some kind of telephonic means. Most agencies that I've worked with are doing more what you all are doing, using some kind of an online platform with Zoom, so people can actually, see the commission meeting happen. There's something about it, you get something from watching the action as well. But being able to hear and be heard is an absolute minimum right now in terms of what's going on with public meetings. So what happens if you get it wrong? That's kind of a common question we get, and kind of look at it from 2 points of view. From a programmatic point of view, somebody could file a lawsuit challenging whatever action you took, and then it's up to the judge, and the judge can do a range of remedies. One of them could be to overturn your action. Meaning that you would have to go back and basically do it over again, because it would have happened behind closed doors or something like that. It would have been a violation. Whether a judge will do that or not is very fact specific. That's kind of the extreme of what could happen. And then the other piece that happens, and this is where some commissioners are like, oh, I didn't know that, was there can also be personal liability. So if you knowingly violate the OPMA for the first knowing violation, it can be a $500 penalty, and each subsequent violation is $1,000. So it does have some consequences for you. And then on top of that, you'd end up paying attorney's fees to whoever brought the challenge. So that's what happens if you don't comply with the Open Public Meetings Act pieces of it. One of the questions that I commonly get is, what's an executive session? Can we have a closed session? And yes, you can. There are some very specific requirements to do it, and some very specific reasons why you can go into executive session. They're specifically set out in statute. And one thing that I always recommend people do, and this I've done this working with the commissions that I've represented, is every time we're setting an agenda with an executive session, going back and looking at those, and going back and looking at the way those are structured. One of them is to evaluate the qualifications for office, and you can do that in executive session. Another one is if you're trying to get you're trying to get advice from your client. Get advice from your attorney. You can go into executive session for that kind of thing as well. For a while, I think there was this belief that people were inviting attorneys to meetings and just kind of putting them in the corner and trying to hide, and using their attorneys as shields. So it really has to be for the purpose of getting attorney-client privilege, and there's some structure that has to be followed there. But you can do it for that reason as well. There's other ones I doubt you got to run into, like for national security or things like that. But I know there's been a request for having an AG assigned to assist you along the way as you do your work. they can help you kind of work through that process as well. So I think there's any. The other kind of, in terms of one other common question I get is, tell me about minutes. What does it say when we have to take minutes? And this is one of those places where the OPMA is actually a little bit vague. It just basically says you have to do it. It doesn't give a lot of structure to it. It doesn't say that they have to be, in terms of what has to be in there. I've seen some that are so cryptic that you can barely tell there was a meeting, and then others that look like a transcript. What I typically talk with folks about is you want to be able to tell what happened. You want to be able to, because this is where the archives folk and historians are going to really be interested. I think particularly in the work that you all are taking on here to understand, how did we get from where we are now to the final product, and what was the considerations? What were the ideas that we were discussing in terms of equity, or is it something like that? And so capturing some of that information, obviously not, and then John said, and then Steve said in that kind of detail, but be able to understand the flavor of the discussions. See if I've. I'll make actually one other comment about executive session, and then I'll switch over to the Public Records Act aspects, or part of my discussion this evening. One thing to keep in mind is if you do go into executive session, that's part of a regular meeting or a special meeting. So you actually have to start the special meeting and then go into that executive meeting. And when you do, you have to tell the audience how long you're going to be in that meeting. And it depends on what topic you're dealing with, and you'll announce to the group, we're going into executive session for this purpose, and we intend to be in executive session for 30 minutes. What that means is you can't restart that meeting earlier than 30 minutes. So if you get your work done in 10, you can't restart the meeting, because the idea is somebody may have stepped away, needs to be able to come back and not miss something. On the flip side, at 30 minutes, if you need more time, you can do that, but you have to have somebody come back into the regular meeting and say, we're going to continue our discussions in executive session to evaluate the qualifications of an applicant. We need an additional 10 minutes. We're extending executive session for 10 minutes. We'll be back at 4:55 or whatever the number may be. And that's been done to empty rooms before. But that's the kind of thing you should also make sure that kind of information gets into your minutes. So you make sure you're checking those kind of procedural boxes as well. If there's no questions that I can answer for you specifically on the OPMA, I'm going to switch gears into the Public Records Act and give you another this is a very brief introduction to it, but hopefully, refreshing some of those memories of those things that you've dealt with for, whether it's your time in office or your other experiences. So switching to the Public Records Act, public records, and the starting place, and you'll see this in court decisions, is that public records is very broadly defined, meaning that what is considered a public record is as inclusive as it can be. The courts, when they've looked at it, they really look to the content of a record and say, is this related to the conduct of government? Is this something that is it a writing, which is another element? And the Public Records Act came in 1972 when we were dealing with typewriters and that kind of technology. As we've moved into, whether it's email, text messages, Facebook, other social media, Twitter, what they really look at is the content of that record. And is it something that's relating to something, the business that you all will be doing? And that's very broadly defined. On the flip side of that is if you're not going to provide a record, so say you get a public records request, you identify a record that's responsive, and there's an element you're not going to provide. You have to be able to find a very specific exemption for that. And those can be found in a number of places. Obviously, the starting place for most of them is the Public Records Act at 4256. But an exemption could be found anywhere in state law. There are lots of exemptions that exist in federal law that are incorporated as another statute. Things like medical information under HIPAA. There's a federal treaty for ginseng. So there's lots of different places exemptions exist, but you have to be able to find one of those. You have to be able to say, you're not getting this element of the record or this entire record because of this specific exemption. And when courts take a look at that, they're very much going to look at the text of that exemption and say, yes, we agree with you, or no, this lists 4 things that are protected. You're giving us a 5th thing. It's not on the list. We understand your arguments, but it's not included within exemptions. So so what does it look like? What starts this process going? Each agency has to adopt a public records policy, and that's your chance to kind of tell the audience, tell the public, this is what our process looks like. Here's how you make a public records request. Here's our public records officer's email address. Here's the person you should contact. What the requester has to do is actually is not that extreme. They have to, if we have a policy that directs them to a portal, they're expected to follow that. And after that, they're expected to request identifiable records. We have to be able to understand what they're asking for. That's pretty much, that's the standard. That's the hurdle they have to get over. And once there's no one way that has to come in. They don't have to cite the Public Records Act. A lot of times people will cite FOIA because that's what people know. Or just maybe a letter to your public records officer requesting a copy of something. And it's kind of, what does it look like? And if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, that's the standard. Once you get that public records request, your agent, this is the one hard and fast deadline in the PRA. Your agency has 5 days to give, and it's 5 business days to give an initial response. Holidays don't count, weekends don't count, but within 5 business days, you can either you can give the records requested if you can. That's great. A change a few years ago, if it's on your website, you can give them a hyperlink, and that's sufficient to respond to that request. You can ask for clarification if you're not quite sure what they're asking for. You can deny the request if let's say they've got the wrong agency or there's a reason they wouldn't get it. Or what commonly happens, because we see a lot of requests that are any and all records related to a topic, and so this may be hundreds of pages of records here. You at least have to tell them, thank you, we have your request, acknowledge receipt of it, and give them a reasonable estimate of time as to when they're going to get that information. And it should be based upon the workload of your public records officer, what's going on, and obviously if you gave a request, we think we'll get to this in 3 years, a court's going to have a problem with that. What I commonly see is a range between 15 to 45 days, depending on the request, depending what's going on, things like that. But it kind of has to fit what your agency is facing. So once you get a public records request, this is where the obligation is on the agency to look everywhere it's reasonably anticipated records are going to be found, which means you've got a great opportunity. All of you are just taking on this responsibility, so you're not inheriting a lot of bad practices, so to speak. But I really hope and really encourage you folks to stay on top of it. Use good management right now, because you will get public records requests, and if you do it now, you'll be much happier when you have to provide those records to your public records officer to help you produce them. But it's going to be the agency's obligation to look everywhere it's reasonably anticipated those records may be. And like I said, that includes if you end up using your personal text messages, or if you put things in your personal social media accounts. If it's related to the conduct of government, and in those capacities, in private devices, private accounts, if it's within the scope of your employment, and as that relates to commissioners and whatnot, is if it's part of your job, part of your responsibilities as a commissioner, if it's specifically required, or if it furthers your work as a commission, a court is very likely to say that's a public record, and it's going to come down to the specific content of that record. Which is why I really recommend folks work within your system, try to keep all of your records inside of your agency systems, so that you're not responsible for maintaining all those records, searching for those records on your personal devices, because there's a whole lot of obligations that arise. I've talked a little bit about exemptions already in terms of they're narrowly construed. I want to mention a couple of them. One of them is privacy. I think there's a lot of folks that believe there is this really robust privacy interest, privacy right in records, and that is not the case. The type of information that is protected by privacy is very personal stuff. It's the kinds of things you only talk about with your attorney, or with your partner, or with your doctor, or something like that. It is not stuff that is maybe embarrassing and things like that, or you're not totally proud of, but it's a very high burden, and it's not a standalone exemption. It has to be incorporated through some other way, and there's numerous exemptions in the PRA that reference privacy. But as I said, it's a very high burden, so I wanted to mention it. I know one that came up in the last couple of days is application materials. There is a specific exemption for application materials as well. there is, we could go. I won't go into a whole lot of detail about various exemptions because there are a lot of them. But I will talk a little bit about, once your agency has identified the records, there is no such thing as silent. Well, there is a thing called silent withholding, and what that means is if you have a record and you don't tell the requester that you're withholding it, that means you've now committed this idea of silent withholding, and that is something that, in terms of the courts, that will get you in a whole lot of trouble because the Public Records Act has a range of penalties, and it can be between $0 to $100 per day per document. And it's at the discretion of the court, and as long as the court's analysis is got some logic behind it, it's probably going to get upheld. It's not uncommon. I've seen some, what is considered a low Public Records Act violations at $15,000. The high water mark we've seen so far is a PRA judgment against an agency for $1.6 million. That took a fair amount of bad facts to get there. That doesn't happen every day. The other thing that happens, though, is in addition to these penalties, because the idea behind the penalties is to encourage an agency to get it right, to next time not have this problem. And so that's where training comes into play. If you can try, so that this was an error, we thought the exemption applied and it didn't, the penalties tend to be lower versus if you commit silent withholding or if you just ignore or, deceive a requester, that's when the penalties tend to creep up. The other thing that happens is you're also going to be paying attorney's fees. There was a case recently where the penalties for an admitted violation were about $15,000 and the penalties, the attorney's fees were $45,000. So there's some real financial implications behind getting Public Records Act requests incorrect. A question that often comes up is, as you're doing your analysis, a question that I get is am I personally liable for this? And this, unlike the Open Public Meetings Act, where it's a personal liability, this is liability to your agency and whatnot. But this is where it really comes from a culture of the agency. Small agencies typically don't have too much of a problem with this because you as the leaders and you're going to have a chair sometime soon and some staff can really set the tone for transparency and openness, responding to public records requests and whatnot. It's that kind of a culture that really kind of plays into having penalties be set low and things like that. I've kind of run through the Public Records Act in a very short period of time. I think I was given about 20 minutes. And I'm right about that right now, so I'm trying to respect your time as well. Can I answer any questions for you about either the Open Public Meetings Act or the Public Records Act? If it turns out that you'd like some assistance with either PRA training or OPMA training to meet the formal requirements, obviously I'm happy to help with that as well. Or when you have an AAG assigned to it, I can work in conjunction with them as well. But if you have any questions, I am happy to try to answer them.
I'll jump in with one. Morgan, thank you very much for the presentation. That was excellent and a great overview. I think a value of ours going into this is to try to is an effort to make this as transparent and as publicly accessible and as inviting of public comment as possible. I think it's going to be extremely important as we go into our work as a commission. And technologically, it was a challenge to get that off the ground with this first meeting. But I think as we work on bringing in our chair, as we work on having more meetings, we really want to make this public, we hope that we're able to make the public comment portion of the substantive, transparent areas. I mean, for the purposes of this, and we were going to mention it, I think later in the agenda, there is an email alias which has been set up, which is just comment@redistricting.wa.gov, where there can be this in the context of the pandemic, in the context of so much of this work being done remotely, questions for us to look toward of others in this kind of or ways over the past year during COVID of achieving that.
I've seen a lot of really good work being done out there from across the state in terms of the portals. And I was watching a hearing a little bit ago, Open Public Meetings with the city of Woodinville, and they did the same. They had public comment periods, and they invited folks both to submit it if they wanted to address the group as part of the as part of the meeting going on, they'd open the mic for that, or to submit if they were submitted in advance. It was about 45 minutes where the chair was actually reading the comments, and they'd put some reasonable restrictions in there in terms of how long, so somebody didn't try to submit War and Peace and that kind of a thing. Some kind of word counts, kind of analogous to giving somebody 3 minutes of open mic or something like that, trying to find that balance. That seemed to really work well in terms of getting that information. If it's something longer, obviously it's your choice to receive that, but not necessarily you can post it, in some kind of a robust posting system or something like that. But in terms of reading it to the group so everybody can hear it, that seemed to work really well for Woodinville.
That's great.
Great question. Other questions from the commissioners? All right. Well, I don't see anyone coming off of mute. So thank you, Morgan, for that presentation. That was great, really helpful information. And I think I'll be considering social media, which is something that I hadn't thought of as part of the Open Public Meetings Act piece. So thank you for that. Did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, thank you very much for inviting me and to be part of this evening. There is some resources available. I know I shared a couple of pieces of paper that MRSC makes available on their website. We also publish an open government manual as part of our webpage as well. That has a little more information than I was able to get into tonight. But thank you all for inviting me, and best wishes and good luck on your endeavor here. You have a lot of work in front of you.
Thank you very much. I also want to point out that part of the Redistricting Commission's rulemaking process will need to start soon. And we have Jennifer Mees. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yes, that's correct.
Great, thank you. From the Code Revisor's office. She's with us today and she can take any questions about the rulemaking process. So are there any questions from the commissioners?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I'd also like to point out that we were able to secure an Assistant Attorney General. Well, actually, in this case, it's a Deputy Solicitor General, Tara Heinz, who's joined us on this call as well. So she will be assigned to the Commission to help you through the rulemaking process and also answer any other sorts of legal questions you may have along the way.
Fantastic. Welcome, Tara.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Yes. Jennifer, was there any information that you wanted to share with us as part of this meeting?
Yeah, well, I guess we're going to wait to go into more detail until everybody's on board there. But I'll be going over the register procedures, the steps for filing, the forms, our calendars, and why it's important that those be followed to give the public proper notice, as well as getting the rules perfected by our free typing service to agencies. And I am available anytime with questions before we end up getting together or after. So if you have questions, just give me a call and hopefully I'll be able to fill in the details for you guys pretty soon.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, if there are no questions for Jennifer or specific questions for Tara from my fellow commissioners, we'll move along in the agenda. The next item up on the agenda is a briefing on the commission budget. And we're going to hear from Bernard, Dean, and Brad Henderson again.
So I believe you should all have in your packets kind of a brief overview of the current fiscal year budget. I'm going to as a former appropriations committee staffer, I feel a little odd talking about budgets without actually looking at any numbers. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Just bear with me for a moment.
We're getting fancy now.
It's not too fancy. It's pretty simple. 21, the fiscal year that began in July of spans two different biennia. So really what this is showing you, January through June of 2021, original 2019-21 biennium budget that was in addition to funding eligible to receive $100 per day for every meeting. Funding for that, you do have funding for 9 FT being hired in January, so there'll be some ramp up. So you probably will have some savings associated with that. See here that almost half of the current fiscal year budget is dedicating expenses as well as the cost of the staffing a director. And so we'll be responsible for managing the day-to-day activity for administrative staff. I think there's funding for staff, GIS data specialists, specialist, or public information officer, as one process that is going to, solicit a lot of public. So you'll need to probably do a lot of outreach to look at the various options that are being considered as you begin to incorporate into that process. And so there is, both possibly print outreach, media outreach, and stand up a website that goes beyond just a standard internet page. So those 9 staff, the funding for those 9 staff, I believe 10 years ago, while our legislative structure of the commission, I believe 10 years ago, a FUNK website is available for your perusal if you haven't. There's a $25,000 travel budget, hearings in different corners of the state. Obviously, may not fully utilize those funds, and we'll probably need to. We don't know when things will improve as far as the ability to. So that funding is there. Then there's some funding for it says capital, and actually, so myself have expenditure authority. So we have already initiated some equipment purchases. Been able to work with our legislative support services office. That may be hired. And so we've already kind of gotten the ball rolling. I should note that for the upcoming biennium, $2 million. And again, that's getting in July. And I think there was some, there may be a need to seek some additional funding and sort of closes up. And we can certainly work with, so that's at a very high level, I guess, kind of in a nutshell to any of that.
No,
I will stop sharing my screen. The other thing I should note is that I mentioned earlier the Legislative Support Services Office. The 3 former legislators here are familiar with them. They do a lot of our support. Many years ago, we consolidated services between the House and the Senate for a variety of different things. We have a print shop, et cetera, facilities people. One of the things that they have done more recently is they have an accountant that's shared with some of our joint legislative agencies. And so we have an individual on staff who will be available to help process various payments, including payments to reimburse you all for any expenses you may incur as you perform your duties. And so we've done a little bit of work on trying to get that set up as well. And again, once we have a chair and a director appointed, we will hand off a lot of this to those individuals.
Thank you, Bernard. Any questions from the commissioners? No one's coming off. I have a couple of questions. One is regarding the allocation for travel expenses. Since we don't anticipate travel, at least in this biennium, can that money be reallocated for outreach or other programmatic areas?
Yeah, what I've displayed there are the allotments, and so the appropriation is just a straight $1 million, and it's not provisoed for a specific purpose, so you can redesignate some of those funds for other needed activities. Okay,
so if we wanted to expand language access or offer interpretation for different meetings, that's an option based on the budget.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. And then my other question is just thinking about the staff, and looks like we've got 9 FTEs allocated. Do you know, or does anyone in this meeting know if during the last commission, if the staff adopted any sort of code of conduct, or if there was any ethics training, or what additional training was provided for the staff?
I'm not familiar with the training that occurred for the staff who were brought on board 10 years ago, but certainly we can arrange for ethics training. And I guess the question is whether it's legislative ethics or executive ethics, but we can certainly arrange for that.
Yeah, I'm also really interested in a code of conduct. I know that the legislature has adopted a code of conduct and some other commissions have. So I'd really be interested in exploring a code of conduct for our commission, both for the commissioners and for the staff to kind of guide how we participate in this process.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly, share the code of conduct that we've developed for the legislative branch. And, in working with you and your chair and the other members and the director, we're happy to help any way we can as you look at that question and develop your own code of conduct.
Great, I appreciate that. Any other questions come up for folks? All right, look at that, still way ahead of time. This rarely happens in meetings. So I think that brings us to next steps and wrap up. So this concludes the presentation portion of the meeting. I do want to note that we have Jay Jennings from the Secretary of State's office on. So if any of the commissioners have questions specific for the Secretary of State's office, or if Jay has anything that he wants to add to today's meeting and conversation, I would invite him to come off mute.
Thank you very much. I would just say good afternoon, and both Nick Ferris and I are here as a resource during your deliberations. Glad to help where we can.
We're happy to have you here, Jay. No questions for Jay from the commissioners? All right, well, we are statutorily required to select a non-voting commission chair by the end of this month. So our plan is to spend the remainder of this meeting in executive session to discuss the candidate qualifications and then reconvene on Saturday at 10 a.m. to vote on the 5th commissioner. I do want to just lift up that we do value and welcome public input in this process. And like Commissioner Walkinshaw mentioned, we do have an email address set up, comment@redistricting.wa.gov, so folks can forward their comments to us. Before we break for executive session, I just want to see if any of my fellow commissioners have anything for the good of the order.
I would just ask really briefly to make sure that, and it may already be the case, that comments that are submitted through there are forwarded to the various commissioners' commission email address.
Absolutely, that's a good catch.
Commissioner Sims, I had one good of the order question that might be directed to Bernard. And Bernard, thanks for the great presentation. Thank you. Is it typical when we go into executive session to invite to also invite the Assistant Attorney General who's tasked to join us in that executive session? I wondered if you had an opinion on that, or is that more to the discretion of the commissioners?
I believe it's more at your discretion. She is available for that purpose if needed. I believe she'll need some additional information to connect to that meeting. I guess I would also remind the commission, given the advice of Morgan Demereau, that before you do convene an executive session, you will need to announce the time that you return.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, maybe that's something that we as have thoughts.
The presence of counsel in executive sessions is most helpful in having someone make sure that we're not straying out of the territory that is the purview of an appropriate purview of an executive session. So.
Right.
Well, I'm fine with.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure. I was looking for the link for the executive session. I'm not certain I have it on my calendar here, so I'm just going to look for that.
No worries, Commissioner Fain. We're actually going to stay here, but before we break for executive session, I propose that we go into executive session for 30 minutes. I propose two things: a brief comfort break and stretch break. We begin our executive session at 5 o'clock, and that we stay in executive session for 30 minutes, come back here, or invite participants back here at 5:30.
Sounds good. And Commissioner Sims, I agree with that. And just to build on Commissioner Fain's comment, I would Assistant Attorney General to join executive session if she's available.
Have you here. So I think the way this is going to work, is that Taylor is going to assist with closing out this session and moving us into an executive session. So commissioners and Tara, we will stay here. And then at 5:30, when we open our session again, Taylor will rejoin our meeting and do all of the magic behind the scenes to make this open to the public again.
Okay, I believe we're live and ready to wrap up.
Fantastic. Well, welcome back. I suppose we call the meeting back to order since we've returned from executive session. And we have just a few moments for any final comments or remarks from the commissioners. And I'll open this up and invite any of the commissioners to kick off their final comments.
I just want to compliment you on a fine job as chair for your first meeting here, and probably the last, but still appreciate you working through this for us today, and appreciate the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Y'all were really tough on me as chair, so. All right. Paul, are you off mute? Did I see?
Oh, I accidentally clicked on that. Completely agree. Well chaired, and I'm looking forward to this whole process.
Brady?
No, nothing from me. Just thanks to the legislative staff, and thanks to the Secretary of State's office, the Attorney General's office, and everyone who helped to pull this meeting together.
Yeah, I want to echo that. A big shout out to the team for pulling this together. I want to remind folks who joined us tonight that you can submit your written comments to comment@redistricting.wa.gov. And we will reconvene at 10 a.m. on Saturday to finish the work of selecting our fifth chair and our chair and our fifth commissioner. So thank you all for your participation and attending tonight. We will see you all on Saturday.